Just to show you this, that's all. I've been working on the World War II memoirs.
Yes.
And fortunately, my mother kept all my letters. And I have about 76 of them now.
Right.
And I was noticing in one of the letters while I was in the hospital that how we love to sit around and talk about the war. And then I got to thinking, I wonder how many. Because, you know, I taught at A&M forever, and I would tell them war stories. And they would say, you know, my granddaddy was fought in World War II, but he never talks about it. And I believe that's a majority.
Right.
And I got to thinking, now we guys that were in the hospital and were sitting around talking, we're the exception. We didn't look around and wonder why the rest of them weren't.
Right.
But isn't that interesting, though, that you've got people like, you see, the way I feel about it, was it was one heck of an adventure. The biggest adventure of my life that I would not want to repeat.
Indeed.
Indeed, right. That was right. But on the other hand, it was the greatest adventure of my life. I think part of it is that I was always interested in military things. In fact, I thought I wanted to be a professional soldier. And I learned in the Army that I didn't want to be, but not for the reasons you think. You know what it really is? I'm a dirty desk man. I am chaos. And the Army doesn't like people like that. Also, I'm kind of a independent soul. I like to ask why. Right. And they don't like guys that say why. Yeah. And I don't like to be shouted at by guys that are dumb. Right, right. So it's those things. It's those things, in other words. I'm too independent and too much of a slob. I really am a much better college professor.
Tell me about, you taught at A&M for how long?
Really, all told, 45 years. 38 full-time and 7 half-time.
In what department?
Chemical engineering.
Okay.
Yeah. I started. And actually, I've been here longer than that because I actually got my PhD there, too. I was teaching when I got my PhD. After I got my master's, I always tell people the pay was so terrible back in those days that they had to get students to teach. Yeah. And so I was able to get on while I was still working on my PhD. And they probably couldn't find anybody else, so they just kept me. I hope it wasn't quite that bad, but anyway.
Well, start your story for me. Tell me about your service and how you got into it and where you went and everything.
As I say, I was always interested in military things, and back in, I used to listen to the radio and infuriate my big brother because if I'd turn on at 7:30 in the morning to listen to the news and see what was going on with the various wars. But I joined the Home Guard at 16. Then from there I went to Virginia Military Institute. And from there I joined the reserves and went to Baylor for 1 quarter in this Army Specialized Reserve Training Program. They called it the A-12 program. Then while I was at Baylor, I turned 18, and 40 days later, I was in the Army.
What year are we talking about now?
44. 1944. I was inducted into Camp Walters, Texas, on May the 13th, 1944. I just turned 18 the April before. I'm at the young end of people who saw much combat. Yes. Went to Camp Walters. From there, I went to Fort McClellan, Alabama, for my 17 weeks of military training. Which I have a lot of criticism of, because here they were in 17 weeks trying to teach guys to do the most dangerous job on earth. Exactly. And wasting time with things like military courtesy and close order drill, which you don't need on the front. And if you want to teach discipline, teach it with combat tactics. Teach it by running maneuvers and that sort of thing. You can teach discipline by doing anything and making a guy obey orders. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be close order drill. Has been of no value probably since the Revolutionary War, or something like that. But anyway, I didn't go right overseas though, because at that point in time I was still 18, and they really had a policy, if possible, they didn't send 18-year-olds directly overseas. Well, there was the 70th Division at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, that was going to go overseas shortly, and so they sent a whole bunch of us there. We got about a 10-day leave, and then I reported at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. And I went overseas with the 70th Infantry Division. I didn't fight with them though. And that in itself is an interesting story, which I really don't like to belabor on, though I did at length in here, because it was sort of a dark moment. I had a vendetta going with the assistant squad leader. I see. We hated each other, to put it mildly, and we were in constant warfare with each other. And we got up to close to the front. In fact, that's kind of interesting. It took a long. We landed. We moved up to Boston. From Boston, we took a ship, the America it was, that they'd converted over into a troop transport through the Straits of Gibraltar, landed in Marseille. After a few days there, they loaded us on the boxcars and shipped us up the Rhone River and across into Alsace. Probably, I would guess somewhere around Colmar. Is probably where they dumped us.
Right.
And all night long we marched towards, they were having an artillery duel at the front. And all night long we marched towards those guns, getting louder and louder, sometimes passing crosses alongside the road. Oh, I tell you, that I think about that, just thinking of the emotion, all these guys that never have been in combat, marching closer and closer to the guns, you know.
Right.
But we didn't get there. We stopped a mile or two, probably no more than a mile, short of where the actual front was. Well, after we'd been there about a day, the captain called us out and said he was really sorry, that he hoped we would all go into battle together, but he'd been ordered to send a couple of thousand men north. You see, we had landed in France the day before the Battle of the Bulge started.
I see.
And they were desperate for replacements up there. And we were not only full strength, we were overstrength. They usually send divisions overseas with some extra men. Well, I knew that I would get selected. So I hurried back, and I was all packed up, because I was not going to let him win the last battle. So when he got there, I was ready to go. Sure enough, though, I was one. Now, only 2 people out of the platoon. I was one of them, which I knew. So I didn't fight with the 7th Division. They loaded us on a truck, and we spent about 16 hours all night long riding through the most desperate cold weather in an open truck. Freezing to death. Finally, about dawn.
Was this October, November? When was this?
December.
In December, okay.
It was
so the Battle of the Bulge was going now.
Yeah, right after Christmas. So we got to this old castle where they unloaded us, and fortunately it was warm inside, but we had to sleep on the marble floor with nothing under us. But that was okay. It was wonderful. The next morning they called us out to divide us up. We were replacements, it turned out, to the 80th Infantry Division.
Okay.
Maybe just 318th Infantry Regiment. I'm not sure now. But either way, when we got out there were hundreds of men. Just hundreds. A captain got up on the hood of his Jeep and started reading out our names, and he was only sending them to battalions. Red, 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 red. And then he stopped. And he said, the rest of you men are in the 2nd Battalion, 318th Infantry. We looked around, and there were still hundreds of men. Some guy held up his hand and said, Captain, what are our chances? Most of our casualties are lightly wounded. You know what he's saying. Not if you get it, but when you get it, it probably won't be too bad. A lot of times it's just the kind of wound that puts you in the hospital for a few weeks. And that's really true. I think we found that when I was on the front, only about 1/5 of our casualties were dead, and less than 1/5 really maimed. Now, some of the serious wounded were not maimed. There was an old boy in our outfit that was shot here, he was hit here, and it came out underneath his shoulder, and a few months he was back up again.
I'll be darned.
Yeah, went clean through him.
No.
And so he wasn't even maimed, but that could have killed him, just by a miracle it wasn't. I wouldn't call that a lightly wounded.
No.
But on the other hand, it was not maiming. But I would say over half of them were lightly wounded in the sense that a month in the hospital or so, and back out again. So anyway, they loaded us on trucks and divided us among the companies. And I know just as we arrived at Company G, they'd had a little artillery bombardment, and one they'd been in a chow line, unfortunately, and another guy had been wounded. And he had this guy with bloody everything. We all looked at him, and I could tell that the old hands looked at us with a little bit of contempt, you know. You know how many, in a rifle company, there are 120 riflemen. We had 20. Had been at Bastogne and nearly annihilated. They were the first troops to break through the Bastogne with the 4th Army. But boy, you talk about, you know, they say get through at all costs. It had been at all costs. They had literally been nearly wiped out. In fact, you know what I'm going to call that? Band of strangers. Because when an infantry unit has been on the front very long, the casualties are so heavy that nobody knows each other. And not only that, they get knocked off before they get to know them. I was on the front 2 months, and in that 2 months we suffered over 100% casualties, and I lost 3 foxhole buddies. That'll give you an idea. Just turnover. Well, I always tell people that I fought in the Battle of the Bulge, but the truth is I sat out most of what was left in the last half, because we had been so decimated that they put us on a relatively quiet part of the front where they weren't planning anything. The boiler was now downhill for the Germans.
You're in a rifle company with only 20 at this point, right?
Well, they pulled it. No, they pulled in. No, they added 100 fresh men. Okay, I should have said that.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, they added 100 fresh men.
But you had gotten down to.
Yeah, 20. And nobody knew anybody. And there were guys from everything. My new squad leader had been a supply sergeant. My second foxhole buddy had been an anti-aircraft gunner, but he was one of the original guys. He was one of the guys, that came in with me. In fact, you know how many of the original riflemen were left in the company? Now, they'd only been in battle 4 months. One.
You?
Not me. No, I'm talking of the original.
Oh, the original.
That had come in August.
Okay, yeah, you
only
joined.
One was left.
Right.
And they let him go home. So then there was none. Since he was the sole survivor, they let him go home.
Right.
And now there was none. And most of the officers had been turned over. We had a new second lieutenant. He came in with us. But we did sit on a quiet part of the front where about all we did was occupy trenches and get shelled. And I have a good story there, but it's not one that I can probably tell. It's a little indelicate. Real quickly, though, I'll tell you it's funny.
Okay.
The kitchen food was filthy. And we all got diarrhea. And I was sitting up there in the hole, and the German lines were, oh gosh, a couple of miles away across the Sure River, well out of rifle shot. So I had an attack. So I jumped out of the hole, ran just a few feet, and squatted. Then I got through, I hurried back, and just as I jumped in my hole, boom! And I say I'm one of the few guys that was the sole target of German artillery. So they only threw one shell, and it landed right by my hole. They were after me, but I beat them back in the hole. So it took a little while for the guy to say, we got to get the range and everything.
Right.
See, that took a little while.
Yeah.
But nothing was going on, and I know some bored artillery observer over there found the target. Hey, look at that guy. Anyway, that went on for a while. We actually were right out of Edelbrook, Luxembourg. We moved into Edelbrook for a while. Then we moved up on the front in foxholes. But again, nothing was going on but shelling. We occupied a couple of different positions. Finally, on about the 18th and 19th of January, see, we'd now been on the front for, oh gosh, all told, we've been on the front now, getting on 3 weeks, really. And they came up with an idiotic idea. The Germans, they thought we'd retreat. There was a little town there that had been shelling. And so they decided that they would attack it just to see how strong it was. This is idiotic. They got us out at midnight and told us, all they told us was, that town over there, we're going to combat patrol. And we're going to go kind of pick a fight and see if there's anybody there. And if they're there, how strong they are. You could have done this with 4 or 5 men probably just as well. I always thought that somebody dumb made that decision. But it turned out to be worse than dumb, but he didn't know what was going to happen. We headed out across no man's land in about this much snow. And I don't know how far we'd gone. But all of a sudden, no farther than here to that glass wall over there, there was an explosion, the powder from which stung my face. I didn't even know what it was. That's how green I was. Well, I just hit the ground, and I lay there for a minute, and I heard this poor soldier lying no farther than right here from me, gurgling out his last breath. He was dying. My foxhole buddy behind me had been hit. The guy that kicked it off had had both feet blown off. And there I was, without a scratch. Well, I lay there, and it was a mine, but I didn't know it. I didn't know what it was. I thought it was a shell. That's how ignorant I was. I should have known because it didn't make any noise coming in. I lay there for just not long, and then all of a sudden, boom, boom, boom. Some poor guy had panicked and started running. Well, I stood up. I said, there's no use in staying here and getting shelled. And some guy said, shelled is mines. Get out of here. I could have gone up and kicked off a mine myself. As by the grace of God, he yelled at me. So I turned around and stepped out. My foxhole buddy had picked up a piece in his leg. The platoon, the company exec officer had both of his legs riddled. He'd gone with us. I knew second lieutenant was dead. There wasn't enough of us left to carry our wounded out even. So we carried out what we could. Only the walking wounded could be carried out. But in less than a minute, we'd lost 21 out of 35 men. Just mines.
Goodness gracious.
And there went my first foxhole buddy. I took my foxhole buddy down and handed him off to somebody after we got back down to our lines. Crawled back in my foxhole. 2 other guys crawled in my foxhole with me. They had both lost their foxhole buddy. One of them lay in the bottom of the hole crying, saying he couldn't take it anymore, and he deserted the next day. None of us saw him take off. The other guy, who became my next foxhole buddy, he was the anti-aircraft gunner, went to sleep, and I sat there looking out across no man's land, standing guard. One guy was supposed to stand guard in every foxhole. The next day, since we'd lost so many men, they pulled us back into Edelbrook to give us a little rest. And we were met on the outskirts by a lieutenant, and he looked at us and said, "Well, where's the rest of you?" And about 3 guys spoke up at once. No, he said, he said, "Where's the rest of the platoon?" And they spoke up at once and said, "This is the 2nd platoon." And all of them, I saying, it was kind of a bragging, really. They wanted to see the shocked look on the lieutenant's face. And it did. We got a shocked look on the lieutenant's face.
I'll bet.
So we went back into town that day, and then we went back up to the front and back in our foxholes. And it was either that night or the next night that they decided to go on the offensive. This was the tail end of the Battle of the Bulge. We were caving in the southern flank of the Bulge. There was a blinding blizzard. I mean, the temperature, how low it was, I don't know. It must have been 0 or lower, and the wind 30 or 40 miles an hour with snow blowing. You might think, then you're going to attack? It turns out that the greatest victories are often won when you attack when or where the enemy thinks you can't or won't. So anyway, the whole battalion kicked off towards the enemy lines. We had a patrol out on our left flank. I know, maybe on the right too, but I only was aware of the left flank. And he couldn't go very far, because if he went very far, he couldn't see us. They practically fell in the German machine gun nest, and they were all asleep. So they captured them. We had a guy who spoke German, a German boy who spoke German. He went up there, and I could tell he was threatening them with all kinds of stuff. He was paying no attention to the Geneva Convention, I promise you. And they talked. They said, "Oh, well, the rest of us are over in that little woods there." There was about a platoon of Germans. They left as a rear guard, because that was plainly could guard the road, see. So we surrounded them, and then we sent them, well, at least 1 or 2 of them, I don't know, inside to tell them that they were surrounded and they better come out. And sure enough, they did. So we had eliminated the German rear guard without firing a shot.
Wow.
So we headed down the road, and we were able to go, I'd say, 4 or 5 kilometers before we stumbled into a German patrol. In fact, we were strung out in a line, really, and I heard Burke gunfire up ahead, and the word came back real fast that they'd run into a German patrol. Well, we were right on the outskirts of Borchardt, which was our objective. So we just ran forward and got in a line. The second, we were bringing up the rear because we had so few men left. The 1st and 3rd platoon immediately it was down a hill. Borchardt was down in the little valley, and it was down a hill through snow that was now about like so. Gosh, I was tired, frozen, and that snow, you could hardly move in it. The 1st and 3rd platoon headed down the slope, and we came down behind them. And I just thought I couldn't move, and about that time a bullet popped by my head, and I kicked in my afterburners. and all of a sudden, I passed this house, and all of a sudden I realized there was nobody with me, except one guy. And I stopped for a minute. Oh boy, I could have been killed because I didn't know what to do. I looked around, and then I suddenly realized that I was a target, so I ran forward and threw myself behind a little row of hedge about this high. After I'd laid there for a minute or two, I looked around, and this other guy was still in the open. And I got ready to yell at him, and just as I did, he went and never moved again. Dead, just like that. That was the second guy that had been killed within a few feet of me in about 2 days. Well, I noticed that on the back of this house there was a little thing that looked like a porch, so I ran as hard as I could and threw myself in it. And it turned out it was just a little, there was no back door, it was just a little area where they piled junk and stuff. So, but there were about 6 guys hiding there, including my foxhole buddy that had disappeared. So I just hunkered down behind the junk like they were, and just about that time a hail of bullets arrived. Sawdust was raining down on my head from the bullets whacking above my head. And my foxhole buddy yelled, "Do something, do something." I said, "What's the matter?" He said, "They put 2 bullets through this table I'm behind." So I stuck my head up, and real quickly I saw that they must be firing out of these windows. So I screamed, "Everybody shoot at those windows." And you know, when we all poured fire into those windows, it shut the German fire off just like that. So we ran around the building. I brought up the rear, and I didn't see this, but just as I went out the rear, according to another guy, said the German machine gun ate up the wall behind me. But I was running so hard that I wasn't even aware of it.
Goodness.
So we took cover inside the building. Turned out that's where everybody was, including our brave captain and his whole menagerie of people. And I didn't have anything to do, so I sat down against the wall and started fixing my breakfast. always nothing else to do, you eat. Well, about that time, one of our tanks, the tanks had trouble keeping up with us because of the snow. Yeah. One of our tanks arrived, but it was on the other side of the town. And he saw people firing out of our windows, and he thought we were Germans, so he opened fire on us and slammed a 76 millimeter shell into the house we were in. Fortunately, we were all on the other side of the house, and the walls were stone about like that. Those houses were forts, so he just blew a hole about that big in the side of the wall. But the captain came running, do something, he says. Well, fortunately, he had his radio man, and the radio man radioed the tank, and the tank didn't fire anymore, but I was still eating my breakfast. So another soldier looked at me and said, how in the world, almost indignantly, can you eat your breakfast in the middle of all of this? And with maximum bravado, I said, might as well die with a full stomach. That's an 18-year-old talking big. You know? But really and truly, there was nothing to do. I was right, really. Yeah. There was no place to hide. We were on the other side of the house from that tank, and the best defense we had was the stone walls of that house.
Exactly.
So there was really, there was no use in, I wasn't going to get out of the house, that was for sure.
Yeah.
Because there was a machine gunner out there, we knew.
Right. Well, when you tell people you fought the Battle of the Bulge, you did.
I did, but that's the tail end of it.
Yeah, but
boy, did we make up for it, because besides the guy that was killed by me, another guy had been killed coming down that hill. And then about a day later, they sent a few, not I, but they sent a few guys out on patrol. Well, I'm kicked off another mine. That was another mine gone. We were down to less than a dozen men. And a few days before, we'd had 35. So we'd suffered a good 70% casualties in about 2 or 3 days of fighting.
Right. So have you been wounded yet?
No, I never was wounded. My feet froze.
Right.
Yeah. I spent 3 months in the hospital. Well,
with frostbite? Or
really, it was trench foot and infected blisters. I got blisters on my feet, and they got horribly infected. And finally, they got to where I couldn't walk. In fact, I had to. This is the trouble. If I warmed up my feet, I couldn't walk. The pain was so bad. But if I let my feet get numb, then I could walk.
Right.
But that made my feet freeze all the more.
So, yeah, then
so I really
you could lose your feet that way.
Yeah, and so here it was a vicious circle.
Right.
So anyway, yeah, this is a good one too. It shows what soldiers do on the front. After we took that town, we lost about 20 men out of the company taking the town, and 2 men out of what was left of my platoon, 2 killed out of what was left of my platoon. But the total company had lost about 20 men taking the town. Anyway, we dug in on the other side of town, and my foxhole buddy and I got to scrounging around in the town, and we found a barn full of hay.
What town was this?
Borchardt. By the way, there's a castle there. In fact, I took a shot at a German soldier. I didn't tell you that. Germans. It's about 1,000 yards away, but I was looking out the window and I saw this German soldier take out the castle. And I fired at him a couple of times, and I scared him. He started running. Couldn't possibly hit him at 1,000 yards, but I frightened him. But anyway, there's a castle there, and it's a tourist town. My wife and I went back there in 1973. In fact, there's a couple of things there. We went back to Edelbrook first. A guide wanted to show us Patton's statue there. By the way, I was in the Third Army. And wanted to show us Patton's statue. And the instant, this was in Edelbrook, the instant I saw that statue and saw the hill over here, I didn't even look at the statue. I said, that's where the Germans were. We were right over here. And I recognized that instantly. That hillside was where the Germans were at Edelbrook. But now, at Borchardt, I went back, and that hedgerow that I hid behind in 1945, about this tall, was now up about this high. The house that had the shell hole in it that I'd taken refuge did nicely fix the shell hole, but that back porch that wasn't the back porch was still there. And I found the barn that I think we got hay out of. And it was interesting. There was a rock fence and a German machine gunner behind it, and he was dead, lying in a pool of blood. And I located that rock wall. I told the guide, I said, there was a dead German machine gunner lying right there.
Goodness.
So that little town.
This was 1973?
1973. About halfway between then and now, really. Not, in fact, it's been a little more since then. But anyway, this was from 45 to 73.
Right.
And anyway, we stayed there about 3 days and moved out. I don't know where we went. They took us to a little German town in trucks. We spent about Luxembourg town, and obviously the Germans had left it in a hurry because it was full of abandoned equipment. And then we started marching on a long march, and that's when I wore blisters on my feet. I should have gone to the medics right there. You know why I didn't? When I'd had diarrhea, I'd gone to the medics, and they basically just scoffed at me.
Mm-hmm.
They ain't got time to fool with that. I said, well, they haven't got time to fool with diarrhea, they haven't got time to fool with blisters.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I was wrong, but this is an 18-year-old thing,
mm-hmm.
you know?
Yeah.
And so I just figured I had to tough it. Well, it turned out it did in the end. It took a while. But it's the blisters, I think, more than anything, that finally did in the end.
Right.
I got to where I couldn't walk. But anyway, we marched up to this place on what they call the Sour River. And we occupied some positions held by the 4th Division. They'd dug some nice dugouts. And we sat there for about a week, I guess. Good story about when I went on patrol one night. Now, while we were there, remember now, we had lost a lot of men. My platoon was down to nearly nothing, and the company had lost a good many too. So they filled us back up to full strength again. Another whole bunch of new men. So, in fact, my company has, now, there's about 2 or 3 men. There's nobody that was there originally. There were now 2 or 3 men maybe that had been there when I got there. And then there were about 6 or 8 of us that had come in with me. All the rest were new. And we're up to 40 men again. See, there's 3 squads, each with 12 men. That's 36. You got a platoon leader, a platoon medic, and 2 sergeants. Platoon guide and platoon sergeant. That's 4 more, so a total of 40. They built us up to 40 men. Went on patrol one night with all these green soldiers. It was going to be another idiot patrol. We were going to actually take boats and row across that dang river, and the Germans were on the other side. It was a Siegfried line. That was the boundary between Luxembourg and Germany, and the pillboxes and everything. It was insane. But as we marched along with our boat, I suddenly heard a hand grenade pop. I just turned loose that boat and threw myself in a ditch. Did you know every other man there just stood there? They were all green. They would have been mowed down. The grenade was a dud. The primer, the igniter went off and actually broke up the thing. And a couple of guys got hit with flying metal. But since the TNT didn't go off, it wasn't going hard enough to hurt them. And the guy looks down and says, "Are you okay?" I said, "I'm the only one here that's got any right to be okay."
Right, exactly.
But that's just the difference of what a month of, even though most of that time we sat out. You know, it wasn't that I was any more experienced with grenades. At that point, I'd never thrown a hand grenade in battle. I'd had no more experience with grenades than they had. But you know what? I'd become afraid of danger.
Right.
I mean, I'd become like this, you know, and they hadn't gotten that yet.
Exactly.
You just, boom, you're just like that. When you're like an animal, you know. You instantly respond to those things.
Right.
And they hadn't gotten it. And it's only by the grace of God they would have been mowed down.
Right.
Well, they called off the patrol, and I don't know whether that was the reason or not, but I was so grateful because I thought it was another dumb patrol. Because we would have gotten across in that pitch black night, the water was swift, we'd have had trouble finding our boats, and who knows, pillboxes up there would have probably gotten shot up bad.
Right.
Okay, that was nice. Andy's telling me my wife has an appointment tomorrow. Crossing the Shore, or the Sour. I thought it was the Shore for many years because the Shore turns into the Sour. That was a biggie. That was a major offensive, and we were the assault battalion. We were leading the way, rowing the boats across. It was my Normandy, okay?
Yes, sir.
And it was about the same. Because the Germans, that was the Siegfried line on the other side. And they had pillboxes up there. Fortunately, they were on demand. But it was also one of the great snafus of all times. We had for some time been carrying boats down. It turned out that there was a little road, dirt road, that ran along parallel to the river. And between the road and the river was about 100 feet of woods. So you really had nice cover for your boats. And we could go down there at night and put the boats there. Now, what we were to do is on the night of the attack, when the attack came, we were to run down, grab our boats, run down to the river, row across. The artillery was going to blast away, and when the artillery lifted, boom, we would assault the hill and hopefully take it in one big surge. You know? Well, they all started out, I guess, fairly well. It was a pitch black night, and we stumbled, and you heard fine guys falling off of precipices and sliding in the mud and cursing under their breath. Real quiet night, though. Didn't hear a thing hardly. Occasional bullet here and there in the distance. But it was really very quiet. But we gradually worked our way. But before we got down, the artillery opened up. Did you ever hear a drum fire? You ever read war stories? Back then, I used to love to read war stories when I was young. And in World War I, they spoke of drum fire. That would mean the artillery bombardment was so intense, it was like a drum going off. And they had to have it then, because they'd have to blow away maybe 30, 40 feet or more of wire, or maybe it was yards of wire, and then knock out some of those machine gun nests, well, the infantry didn't have a chance. Well, like 3 o'clock in the morning, I'm telling you, everything was quiet, and all of a sudden, you heard all of these cannons fire, this tremendous whoof, and the other side of that hill just
lit up.
Lit up. I mean, you'd never seen. Turned out we had 12 battalions of artillery and maybe 2 battalions of infantry. There was another battalion down here crossing too, so there were 2 that were actually crossing. And those guys, I'm telling you, it was just steady roar, steady cease. The ground trembled like a never-ending earthquake. You could almost feel sorry for those devils, but you would hope they were killing every one of them. If they didn't, they were going to try to kill you. That was for sure. Well, we finally worked our way down to the edge of the river, and I don't know what time it was. The sun didn't come up pretty late anyway. And we got our boats, and guess what? The little trees were only about this big, and they were so close together we couldn't get our boats through. We couldn't get our boats to the river. Now, F Company got across. Poor old F Company. The only one. E Company had a cliff so high they couldn't get their boats down to the river. Now, you talk about the devil being in the details. They had all this, everything was fixed up, and we didn't get across.
You couldn't get the boats in the river.
Dawn came. We were trying to break the trees down with our hands, but we couldn't make any progress. They were too big. And dawn came, and the Germans opened up on us. And we were sitting ducks, so there was nothing to do but scatter up the hill. I ran about halfway up the hill and took cover in some big old rock outcroppings, along with 4 or 5 other guys. Some of the guys just disappeared. We didn't see them until a day or 2 later. I had to round them up. They didn't cook. They used it as an excuse to keep running, I think.
Right.
But there we were. F Company was sitting there getting pounded. The Germans started pounding us too, but we were, I was hidden in these rocks, so I wasn't in too bad a shape. Finally, along about afternoon, some non-commissioned officer came down and told us to work our way down to F Company, because you're going to get shelled in the process, to work your way down to F Company, because that was the only place we could get across, was where F Company crossed. So I did. I worked my way down there, and right as I got there, I passed an apple tree. This is part of the story. It had a whole bunch of apples underneath it. Now remember, this is stupid, because this is now early February, and those apples are left over from the summer before.
Right.
But I looked at apples. So anyway, I went about halfway down the hill again, and I dug a shallow foxhole. And sometime during the afternoon, they started trying to get men across again. And the captain was in a hole not far from where I dug in, and I heard him say, "I'm not going to try to cross this river unless you order me to." Apparently he ordered him to. So a couple of boats tried, but nobody got across. I don't know how many men we lost. I do know that some of them just jumped in the river and swam out. No use in sitting there and getting shot.
Right.
But I finally worked my way. What turned out, there was a house down by the river. It was one of those stone houses, and it did give cover. And they had some boats behind there, so you could grab your boat. But they could only get about one down at a time, and the Germans, now it was daylight, and the Germans up on that hill just, I mean, good gosh. It was insane. The captain was right. It was easy for the major or the colonel to sit back there and give orders across the river. But nobody made it. All he did was get some guys killed and wounded. That's all he did. So finally he gave up. In fact, just as I got down to where that house was, I worked my way down to the house. There's a guy who had jumped in the river and had swum out, and he says, "I'm not going to do it again." And I think they quit when this guy he'd already been. "I'm not going to do it again." He just told this lieutenant point blank, "I'm not going to do it." And so they didn't cross him from night. Well, night came and they couldn't see us anymore. And with the artillery making lots of noise, we got across without any trouble. We were across, and F Company was dug in. It turned out, this is the way it was. Here's the river, and you've got this hill that comes down, and right as it comes down, it does like this. So they don't have direct fire all the way. There's an area there where you have cover. But then there's about 10 more yards where you don't have cover, and then there's the river. And it's only a few feet where you have cover. But anyway, that's where we dug in. We just kept stringing out our line, stringing out our line, stringing out our line. And daylight came. It finally occurred to those people, and by the way, this is a lesson of war that ought to be learned. If we put smoke on their hill, they can't see. But we can. As I watched those poor devils landing at Normandy or Iwo Jima, I said, why aren't they smoking, the Japs? Why don't they cover that island with smoke?
Right.
Because you're at such a disadvantage until you get a lot of men ashore. And you'll still lose men because they know approximately where you are, but at least you won't be a target that they can aim at.
Sitting duck from the
You won't be a sitting duck, right, exactly. Well, they put the smoke down and it was just as good because with the noise of the shelling and the smoke, they couldn't see, but we could now. It was actually better. And so we kept getting men across. But just about, I don't know what happened, whether they ran low on shells or not, but just as one of our boats landed, the smoke broke. All of them made it with one guy, and a German machine gun opened up. And that poor devil, instead of just going ahead and running the last 5 yards, because that's all he liked, he hit the ground. Well, the German machine gun just went, and I just sat there. I wasn't any farther than here, that chair from him, and I just watched the bullets crawl over. And I said, he's dead. Would you believe he got up and dashed that last 5 yards and didn't have a scratch on him? How in the world, I don't know. He had a dozen bullets land all around him. But he fell down and just sobbed, bawled.
Couldn't believe he escaped.
Yeah, I mean, but you talk about the grace of God. That was one of the closest I ever saw. I mean, he was this far, and I just looked at him. See, I was in the hole, and I was in the shadow of that hill. I was safe. But he was out there where just that close. Probably 1 5 yards, maybe a little farther, maybe no farther than the wall for sure.
Right.
Somewhere in there. And those bullets just crawled over him. You've seen it in the movies, how the machine gun, but well, that's just the way it looked.
Right.
And they just went right over him.
Right.
How in the world it missed him? I'll never know.
Goodness.
Well, we finally got men across all day long, and well, that night was something, by the way. That big guns hammered that night, and if the Germans had been able to counterattack, they could have pushed us in the river so easily. But without big guns, they couldn't possibly move. They couldn't move either.
Yeah.
In fact, during the night, when the guns would let up a little bit, I heard some poor devil out there moaning. And as the night wore on, he got weaker and weaker, and by dawn. By dawn, he was quiet. He'd die. But nobody dared go out to help him. I mean, it was just...
Right.
We're not half through.
We'll keep going.
Well, let's see. Okay, let's see where we are. Okay, we crossed the river.
Are we still in February, January?
Yeah,
February?
we're now on February the
45?
8th. We're February the 8th. Okay, we assault the hill, and we really take it pretty heavily. We've got the Germans heavily outnumbered now. We just storm up the hill. It's rather heavily wooded, and I didn't see anybody. I mean, actually fall in that assault. I saw one dead German. But then we swung around and started, because we'd only taken it over a fairly narrow front, a few hundred yards, and then we swung around with the idea of attacking down the river and cleaning them out. Funny thing happened then. I was actually carrying the Browning automatic rifle. It was the only gun in the platoon that was full automatic. I mean, in the squad. Each squad had one full automatic weapon. The rest of them was semi. So I took my position up on the far end, which I might say was the most dangerous place, thinking I'd be wanted there. But the lieutenant came up and ordered me down the line, and as usual, I argued with him. So I got cursed right then and there, and I did obey orders and moved about halfway down the line. So we started down. I don't know how far we went, but at some point we ran into fire. I only found out later that the guys at that end of the line had been pretty well shot away, several killed. So I probably would have been a casualty right then if the captain had not ordered me down the line. And maybe that's why he ordered me down, is he didn't want his, he wanted to put his firepower in a little bit safer position. Well, anyway, I started raking the woods in front of me and advancing, and all of a sudden I noticed I wasn't getting any fire. So I just kept going forward. On my own. I'm on my own now. And I came to the edge of this woods, and I saw this big old pile of rock over here. It wasn't very far, about as far as that glass window was about all. So I just crawled on my belly up behind it. Turned out my life was not worth a nickel at that point. But fortunately, the Germans were getting fire from farther up the hill, and so they were all looking that way. I wasn't 20 yards from the Germans. And in view of them.
Goodness.
But they didn't see me. I got behind that rock, and I peered around, and I saw a little puff of smoke, and I looked, and I saw a head. I just put his head right on top of my rifle. Then I raked the position. I had this automatic weapon, so I raked them with fire, and I called out to where they were, and we had them pretty well pinned down. Another guy then crawled up beside me, and I lost the hearing in my right ear at this point, or most of it. He crawled up behind me, and I had just emptied my gun, and I was reloading. and 3 Germans got up to make a run for it. Well, my gun wasn't loaded. He threw up his rifle and fired 3 shots with the muzzle about that far from my right ear. He wasn't any farther than much than that fence over there. I mean, really, that fence, that's about all it was, and he missed every time. Did you know that's one reason that everybody doesn't get killed? Panic, da, 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 you know. Instead of just going boom, boom, he could have gotten a couple of them. So, yeah. And all 3 got away. Other people shot at them too. Now, when we got up there were 2 dead men in that hole, and the other one, I think, was shot through here. And I think he probably had tried to get out, and one of the guys over here that now knew where they were, because I yelled at them where they were, had shot him. And so we took that position. Okay. Yeah, that was my greatest claim to fame, because I really helped. Due to my initiative, we took that place without any further casualties. And I had acted on my own totally, and not been ordered to do it. I always said, I've seen guys get Bronze Stars for less, but on the other hand, you know, really and truly, one can get cynical about medals, because when in fighting like that, people don't notice things. Some guy in headquarters do something, anything almost, and he'll get a medal. Or you let an officer do it, and he'll get a medal. But just old riflemen and the infantry in the rifle company, all that stuff just tends to fall through the cracks. Anyway, we took that position and captured the rest of the Germans surrendered. And we sat there. There's some interesting thing happened there. I didn't learn this till after I got in the hospital. And there was a guy in my platoon that was in the same ward that I was in the hospital. And he talked about this guy. Oh, I forgot to tell you that my foxhole buddy had been killed. I didn't know it. We'd been separated in the fighting. And he and another guy named Ray, the reason I remember Ray, several reasons, I can tell you if I have a little time. He and Ray had gone into this dugout, and it was empty. And when they came out of the dugout, 3 Germans came out of another dugout just at a short distance away. Everybody opened fire. Well, my foxhole buddy went down, 2 Germans went down, the other German ran, and Ray was the only one still standing. My foxhole buddy got 2 bird guns bullets through the chest, and he died. That was my second foxhole buddy. Anyway, Ray, the same guy Ray, had been dug in at the end of a little path that came up there. Now, I didn't see this. I was down the line of ways. And it was all wooded, see. And a German soldier came walking down that path. And Ray saw him, and Ray shot him. Well, during the day, a total of 5 or 6 Germans came walking down that path, every one of them, one at a time, and Ray killed every one of them. Never could figure that out. But he sat there during the day and killed about 5 or 6 Germans, walking singly, one at a time, down that path.
Goodness.
Ray was a good soldier, by the way. He was one of our killers.
Right.
Anyway, we sat there then for a night, and then we moved out kind of late in the day, and then we didn't hit German opposition, so at night we dug in. But along about midnight or something, maybe not that late, we kicked off again. I'm so tired now.
Have you slept? I mean, have you slept?
No, that's the point. Not really. Yeah, no. And
right. I guess the night.
Yeah, a little bit of cat napping, but I can't really sleep. And I am just dead now. Anyway, so we're now going to attack the town of Biesdorf, Germany. It's another little town. And we move in without any opposition. We get into the town quite a ways. Turns out it's full of Germans, though. It's dark, so dark you can't see your hand in front of your face. Under moonlight, and it was kind of foggy. And no lights anywhere. No electricity probably within miles, you know. And just as dark as it can be. And the platoon leader took about 6 or 8 of us up to the edge of town. He left some in a barn, and then he took some of us with us, and we headed down this path. We heard a few hand grenades go off. Didn't know where they were coming from. And all of a sudden, we were on this street. I say we were on a street, couldn't see anything. We were just feeling our way. An American machine gun opens up on us. Well, that's not surprising, consider the fact that it's just chaos. So we yelled at him, "Hey, we're Americans!" He fires again. Well, fortunately, somebody had found, you know how sometimes you have a house that's kind of elevated, and you'll have a step coming down, and actually you sort of have a little bit of a trench where that step comes down. So and we all took cover in it, so we were fairly safe. He yelled at him again, "Quit shooting!" He fired again. He said, "You shoot again, we're going to shoot back." You know what happened then? Amerikanische Schwein! He has an American machine gun.
I mean,
German with an American machine gun. So the sergeant told us to go back to the barn. We'd come to this barn and stayed there a little minute and then moved out again. On the way back to the barn, one of them got wounded with a hand grenade thrown from somewhere. So we get in this barn, and somebody's throwing hand grenades at us. We don't know where they're coming from, but they bounce off the side of the barn because they can't see what they're throwing at. This is good because the barn's got some windows and so has a big hole blown in the side. Well, I'm so tired that I kind of sat down behind that pile of rock where the big hole was. I went to sleep. I went to sleep with them throwing hand grenades at us. You know? And you know how I was waked up? You will not believe this. I was waked up with a stream of machine gun bullets going about that far over my head, and I looked up and there's a pillbox about 20 yards away. Killed a man right behind me. I looked around to see what was getting the fire, and this poor devil was lying on the floor with his brains blown about that far out. Still breathing, by the way. He breathed for about 30 seconds.
So you'd gone to sleep 20 yards from a German pillbox.
Exactly.
It was light now?
Oh yeah, just barely though.
Yeah.
Just barely. My head was probably visible, but my helmet would look like one of these pile of rocks. This guy was moving. He had walked across this big hole blown in the barn. And he had walked across it. And the German machine gun, of course, knew we were over there. So he saw him walking, and now he went around with my head. I got him right behind me. Well, there was a machine gun squad there, and they'd set up their machine gun behind this pile of rock, but they hadn't stayed there. So they asked me to hand them the machine gun, so I laid on my back and took the machine gun off its stand and handed the machine gun, handed them the stand. Then I crawled out behind the rock myself to a little bit safer place. We tried to attack that pillbox, but you couldn't, because turns out the Germans still had the high ground behind, and they had some artillery zeroed in on it. Because, see, a pillbox is so thick that direct hits by small guns, small artillery, doesn't hurt the guys inside. But it'll kill anybody around it. So we tried to attack it, and one guy, they immediately opened up, and one guy was wounded. And we saw, this is hopeless. You can't buck that, because they can just fire right down into that thing. And also, there was another pillbox up the hill that could give some cover and fire, too. So we fought that pillbox for several days. Now, we did kill a couple of them. One guy, there was a hedgerow that ran up pretty close to the pillbox, and the guy should never have tried this in the daytime. He crawled up as close as he could get, and then he tried to make a break. This is a German. He tried to make a break for the pillbox, and he didn't make it. One of the guys got him. And then there was another guy, another German, that came out of the pillbox. There was a trench that came out of the pillbox and led right by the barn. I know that's where they were throwing hand grenades that first night. He was going to slip up close and pitch a grenade in, but he got his head up too high. And so we got him. So we killed two of them. But finally, other outfits took the high ground over here, knocked out this pillbox. So now we had them, because we could bring fire from two directions at close range on this pillbox. So they couldn't cover us both. So we could shut the guy down. And so then what happened then is 2 or 3 guys ran up and threw white phosphorus grenades inside, and what was left of them came boiling out. So that was the end of the pillbox. By the way, I don't even like to tell this, but I learned this later too. They let one of the guys that had been wounded by the pillbox, he wasn't hurt real bad, I think just had something in his arm, and 2 or 3 other guys take these guys back. There was about a dozen of them. And on the way back, they murdered some of them. I heard they murdered them all in the hospital. After I got out of the hospital, I was telling this, and the platoon sergeant was adamant that they'd only shot 2 of them. That's still 2. So that's a little try. Those things went on. Usually, though, you know, they're frontline soldiers who are angry. They've lost too many men. They're just angry. They want to get even. That's what it is. Nobody ordered it. The sergeant didn't know it. The sergeant found out about it, but he didn't know it until after it happened. But he didn't turn the guys in. They never turned them in. He was always talking about a cover-up, but the truth is they always covered it up. Because, you know, that kind of thing. I don't think there ever was an atrocity that I heard of. After I got in the hospital and we were talking war, I heard of several other pretty gross atrocities. But I've never heard of one that was ordered from a top. It was just all mad fighting guys trying to get even. Is what it was. And that's different. That's different. That's not like this German colonel in the Bulge ordered his tanker to mow down 100 American prisoners, you know. That's totally different. This guy was a colonel. They hanged him, by the way. But, well, we fought in that town, finally got it cleaned up. I wrote a letter. I should have found it. Because he would. I just think, golly, imagine writing a letter like this home to your mother. We rescued a keg of cider. Everybody was drunk the next day. I don't know what I should say the next day. This is shit. I wind up with saying, by the way, I killed my first German the other day. I shot him through the head. That's the way I ended my letter. And I tell them, things have been pretty hot around here. The German pillbox about 20 yards away. We had a pretty good time with them for a while, but we killed a couple of them and smoked the rest of them out with white phosphorus grenades. Wow. That's what I had in this letter that I write my mother, you know. Right. Just telling about war, you know. Sure. But I mean, you know, been a little older, I've been a little more sensitive. Yeah, that's what Mom. But on the other hand, it's a lot better letter now. Yeah. She probably knows they're shooting back at you too. Yeah, so. Right. Yeah. Well, we attacked out of that. Let me see, one or two more. After it quieted down a little bit, they started feeding us from the chow jeep, but the chow jeep came up at 9 o'clock and 5 o'clock, so they couldn't be shelled at night. Right. Well, one night we were over there, and the Germans apparently heard us, and they opened fire. And I had a full mess kit full of food, and so I started running for cover, and I had to hit the ground twice, juggling that mess kit before I could get to cover. But I never lost my food. But when I ate it, it was full of dirt from the shells exploding and throwing dirt in it. That's how close they were. But I'd saved my food. Then we attacked out of that town on about the 18th or 19th of February, something like that. Here's another interesting thing there. I got in the skirmish line, and the guy beat me to it, the place I was going to get in. And I moved down 1 or 2 positions. And as we attacked, the Germans started shelling us, and they dropped one in front of us, and behind us, and they dropped one in front. And I heard the next one coming. You know, you get an ear. You can tell where they're going to land. And this was terrifying. This had our number, I could tell. And I hit the ground and was doing this, looking out though, and the dang thing hit, and a piece of shrapnel dug up the ground about that far in front of my face. I was the first guy it didn't get. It got the guy that took my place. Wow. I don't know that any of them were killed. I know the guy right by me wasn't. He'd been hit in the face and had blood pouring out. But it was a rather small shell. I think it was 60 small mortar. So I don't know that any of them were killed, but they were all wounded. Right. Four guys. I was the first one it didn't get, and the guy that had taken my place. They got him. Well, we ran forward and took cover behind an embankment. Well, the Germans still had our number. They started dropping shells down that embankment. Here they come, here they come. Boy, I dug in some then. They come to where we are, and the shell hits on top of the embankment. Oh, no farther than that lamp, probably. Piece of shrapnel hit the guy in the back of the head, about that far away. Obviously, he wasn't dead, but he was going to die. That was obvious. And a guy about as far away from me, went stark raving mad. I'd never seen such a look on my face.
Hey, y'all still at it?
Still at it.
Oh, I told him he can't possibly cover this in 30 minutes. Maybe if he had 2 or 3 hours.
We might do 2 shows.
Well, see, I haven't even got to the Army of Occupation.
Just enjoyed it.
Yeah, I won't even get to Operation Keel Haul, which is one of the greatest stories of all. Did you ever hear of Operation Keel Haul?
I don't think so. No.
Except for slavery, the greatest atrocity ever committed by the United States. And it came from the top, and I participated in it. That's another story, though. Wow. That happened in the Army of Occupation. And basically, we were rounding up Russians and sending them back to Stalin to kill, which was just like rounding up Jews and sending them to Hitler to kill. There really was no difference. But it was done on a considerable scale, and I participated in it.
That's right.
Yeah, pretty awful, really. Anyway, this guy had this insane look on his face and was letting out these horrible sounds. And all of a sudden he took out running from the rear and would duck even when nothing was coming, and he would duck, and I never saw him again. But this guy was not faking it. I had never seen such madness, insanity on a face in my life. But the way it happened, he just snapped like that. Stark raving mad. Actually, I don't know whether he was the same guy or not. Before we started that attack, the Germans had been shelling the shells were going over our head. But right before we left the outskirts of the town, there was some poor Joe sitting up against the side of the wall of a house crying. Might have been the same guy. I don't know. But I don't know that it was. But this guy, I don't. But they eventually quit shelling, and then that night they took us out. My feet were getting in horrible shape by now. By the way, when we were back in Borscheid, Biesdorf, when we were back in Biesdorf, I had changed my socks one day, and it hurt my feet so bad because it warmed them up that I went down to the company aid station. And I went in there and he said, "What's wrong?" I told him. He said, "Get the hell out of here. We got dying men in here." I went on for 2 more weeks, lost my third foxhole buddy. In fact, what I told you now was after that.
Yeah.
Had a good story there, though, that I forgot about, and that's finding the potatoes. I was crying. We weren't getting enough to eat because we couldn't get bridges across the river because the Germans could shell them out. It was just like fighting at Fort Benning for them. We were fighting on their home ground, and they knew the range for everything. And so they could hit that darn river. And I know one day I only got 1 K ration. I was starving. Well, I was crawling around in the ruins. This town was just blown off the map, hardly a building standing. And I saw this hole down here, and I looked down there, and there was a pile of potatoes. So I dropped down through it, and some on the top were rotten, but they were good underneath. I took my helmet off, took the liner out, filled my helmet up with potatoes, went over to, there was wood everywhere because the house had been blown apart. I made me a nice little stack, and I got a fire going, and I boiled these potatoes, and I had some bouillon powder that had come in one of the K rations. I used that for salt. I ate a helmet full of potatoes. Just felt good. Just felt good. But anyway, we on that night march, my feet were in such bad shape that as I walked, there was blood and pus squishing in my boots. But my feet were numb. This was several days later, and they'd gotten good and numb again. Well, we dug in that night, and it turned out that I dug in a very bad place. Also, I was so tired that I got careless. I laid my gun down so I wouldn't get dirt on it, and we dug the hole, and I forgot to retrieve my gun. Well, the next morning, the Germans started shooting at us. Bullets were popping right over my head. By the way, I was eating my breakfast. I kept right on eating while the bullets popped over. But I got through eating my breakfast, and it occurred to me, I better get my gun. Those suckers just might attack the way they're shooting. I reached out. I couldn't reach my gun. I was going to have to get out and get it. No two ways about it. I jumped out of my hole, and just as I went over, I mean, it was so close that my ears just rang. He couldn't have missed me that far. In fact, he'd have killed him if I hadn't ducked just as he fired. I just fell back in the hole. Well, there was a trench right over here. I had the most dangerous hole in the whole dang outfit. The line was bent like that. This trench ran over here, and I was right at that point. And I was closest to the Germans of anybody, see. So that's why they were shooting at us. My foxhole buddy was just lying down there. He hadn't even moved. He was just crouching down in the hole. So anyway, the sergeant over here said, y'all get out of here. Run over to this trench. Well, I obeyed. I stood up. The instant I stood up, again, just rang my ear. You know, one of the coolest moments of my life. I collapsed like I was shot. And in a half a second, I realized that SOB thinks he got me. If I fling myself out of this trench and run, I'll surprise him. I screamed at my foxhole, "Follow me." I threw myself out, dashed to the trench. Both of us made it without a shot being fired at us.
Goodness.
And that's why. But I was always proud of the fact that my cool thinking could have very well, because it was. It was just like that. I thought, that SOB thinks he got me. He's going to be congratulating himself. And if I throw myself out and can make it to that trench in a couple of seconds, and that's what happened. He didn't even get off a shot. Because he probably congratulated himself. But if I'd fooled around, see, and he'd seen one of us move, he'd been waiting for us.
He'd been ready again.
Yeah, That was one of the closest calls I ever had. He put 2 bullets, both of them just rang my ear. I mean, just ringing, just like a firecracker had gone off in it. I mean, both of those bullets were within inches of my head.
That was a gamble.
That was the closest I ever came to getting killed, I think.
Goodness.
That same day, though, we had another one that day. I have to tell you this one. This is the cabbage patch. A few years ago, I was teaching chemical engineering class, and a young woman on the front row said, "Dr. Davison, tell us about the cabbage patch." Her big brother had been in my class a few years before, and I told him about the cabbage patch. Well, it turned out, and here's what it was. Again, it was my being ever hungry. I never did tell you about the apples. I got lost in other things, but that's okay. I can't tell you everything. I later tried to go up and get an apple. Remember I told you about the apple tree? But when I got up there was a dead American soldier. He wasn't there the first time, who had literally been blown to pieces. Well, I lost my appetite just like that and hurried back to my hole.
Sure.
I mean, he was a mess. Well, anyway, what happened was, later on that day, I know that same day, we'd moved out, and I don't know how we got where we were, but we were being shelled, but the shells were mostly going over us. And there was this field, and I was lying down in this field, and it was muddy, and I was lying in the mud, and I suddenly realized that this was a cabbage patch. But remember now, this is the latter part of February, and those are cabbages left over from the previous spring, just like the apples. I got to thinking, maybe they're big like this, maybe there's something inside. So I started peeling off the cabbages, and sure enough, there was about that much good cabbage.
Find the phone.
Oh, do I have it?
Oh yeah, there
I've got it.
right there, right there.
Anyway, I lay there and ate cabbage after cabbage after cabbage with German shells whining over my head, lying in that muddy field. And that basically was the story. But for some reason they thought that was great. Yeah, I didn't think it was one of my best stories, but they did.
No, there are other food stories you got were even better.
Yeah, I think it was just the idea of eating rotten cabbages when German shells were whining over your head and you were lying in a muddy field, you know.
That was worth the story.
Yeah. Well, I could go on and on, but probably you're saturated.
Well, but when did your feet finally?
Okay. Let me tell you this. This is my last good story. Finally, a few days after that, we made another attack that day. In fact, that's another story, because we made another heavy attack that day, and there's all kind of stories. In fact, I'm skipping some of the best stories to get to the end now. But anyway, what happened? We finally fought our way all the way through the Siegfried line, and then the 4th Armored Division attacked through us. And they routed the Germans. The Germans were in full retreat. And so we were able to pull back into this fairly good-sized town. And they set up a bath. See, I had not had my clothes off for about 2 months. Hadn't shaved for 6 weeks. Had a beard. Hadn't brushed my teeth for a month, I don't think. But anyway, they're going to give us a bath. And here's the way it works. You take off all your clothes and you throw it in a pile over here. You walk inside this shower and you get 5 minutes of water and soap. When you get through bathing, you come out, and there's this huge stack of clean clothes left over from the previous soldiers that bathed, I guess. And you'll find something that fits you. Well, when I got ready to find shoes, that warm water had warmed my feet up. I couldn't get my shoes on. Finally, I was able to get them on, but I was so crippled I could hardly walk. So the next morning, I found an aide. We didn't have an aide guy. I got platoon medic had been wounded, but I found another platoon medic, and he told me where the battalion aide was. And I limped. This was the next morning. My feet had cooled off a little bit. I limped down to battalion aide, and he saw those blisters. I had red stripes running all the way up to my knees, infection, and it was getting black around them. I guess getting almost on the verge of gangrene. So he saw those. You know, he was going to bandage me up, and I said, look, I can't walk. Well, he said, I'll send you back to division. He sends me back to division, hospital there, and that guy looks at my feet, and he says, you got trench foot. So he put me on an ambulance, and this is my last good story. He puts me on an ambulance and carries me down to Thionville, France. And I hear a guy say he's from Beaumont, Texas. So I said, I'm from Texas. We got to talking. I said, I've got a brother who's in the medic. He's in the 92nd Medical Battalion. He said, well, they're just right up the road here. So he calls the chaplain over, and the chaplain says, how long since you seen your brother? 2 years, I said. It had been. So he sent his assistant up to get my brother, brought my brother back, and we visited, I believe, just about all night, I think, until they flew me out the next morning. And I thought that was a wonderful way to end my time.
Where were you now? Where were you?
Actually, you know how Luxembourg comes down like this, and you've got the border of Germany and France? It's the tip of Luxembourg, and the little town of Thionville is right below that tip. And that's where they had an airstrip flying people back to England. So they loaded me on this C-47.
And you went to England? Is that where you were?
Oh, yeah, because with trench foot, you're going to be there a while. I was 3 months, actually.
3 months?
Yeah. In fact, the war ended just a little bit before I got out of the hospital.
Yeah. And then you went home?
No. By the way, this guy, Ray, as we were on our way, this is a funny one. The guy Ray I mentioned, who shot the Germans coming down the path, I was with him when he was wounded. In fact, it was that same day when I quit talking. We'd attacked another woods, and he was standing right beside me when he got a bullet in the arm. And I helped him back. And by the way, that's a good one too. Blood was running down and dripping off his fingers, and old Ray looked at that, and he said, "Boy, ain't that $1 million wound?" It's just a nice clean bullet hole through his arm. See? Yeah. And they put him in the hospital for several months, and it turned out that he and I wound up on the same boxcar going back up. And he says, "You remember that day I was shot?" And I said, "You bet." He says, "We were facing the enemy, weren't we?" And I said, "You darn right we were." He said, "Well, I got shot from behind. Friendly fire." That was an American bullet. You can't tell what direction they're coming. Right. What happened is we'd gotten in front of everybody. And we were shooting. We were the only ones close enough to the Germans to shoot at them. The rest of them were back in this woods. And there was a reason for that. They had actually been in front of us, and they'd run into fire and fallen back. And then, so it was this kind of thing in the woods. And they heard us firing and just thought we were Germans. And so we were getting shot at from both directions and didn't know it.
So what happened after you left the hospital?
Well, after I left the hospital, I came back to my unit, which was down in Kempten, Germany. And we didn't do much anything for a long time. We pulled a little guard duty. Eventually, we inherited a Polish displaced persons camp that we guarded. I learned, that's where I started really learning German, because I pulled guard duty 4 hours at a time with a Polish guard. And they didn't know a bit of English, and I didn't know a bit of Polish, but they had been slave labor, you know, in Germany, and they had all picked up German. But they didn't know very much German, but that was good, because the German they used was small vocabulary, they spoke slowly, so it was easy to learn from them. And they knew what they needed to know, and so what I was learning from them was what I needed to know. So standing guard with those guys about once a day really helped me begin to pick up German quite a bit. Eventually, they shipped out, and for a while I was left behind in Kempten guarding the ammo dump. Then they'd all gone to Czechoslovakia. Remember, we had part of Czechoslovakia for a while. So finally they moved the ammo and got sent to Czechoslovakia. Then I didn't have enough points to go home. They sent the division home, and I was then transferred to the 1st Division in Nuremberg. Would you believe that I wound up living in the courthouse where they were actually having the war crime trials with all the big boys there?
Wow.
Now, I've skipped Kill Hall, totally. Kill Hall happened back in Kempten. But that's another story. That is another story. You could almost spend the time on that, except that's so terrible you might. Did you know that Americans don't know about that? And you know why? It was classified. The Army classified it. And it was the 70s, before using the Freedom of Information Act, some people finally got hold of it.
What Russians were being rounded up?
Russians by the millions, see, had fled Stalin. Now, what does happen? If you flee Stalin, where can you go? West. So you wind up in Germany. After all, if a Polish Jew flees Hitler, he might end up in Russia, right? Or a German Jew fleeing Hitler. Well, if you're...
So these were deserters?
They weren't deserters, though. Some of them were.
They weren't in
but no, a lot of them were civilians.
The Army,
no, a lot of them were women, children.
Who were,
they had simply fled
to get away from
Stalin. Yeah, because Stalin... See, if you were a Russian, Stalin was a lot worse on Russians than Hitler was on Germans. Hitler killed Jews, and he killed enemies. But he was not that rough on the German people. He wasn't paranoid like Stalin. But Stalin, he killed people by the millions. It is estimated that Stalin murdered a minimum of 20 million people. He killed more Ukrainians, for instance, than Hitler killed Jews. And so a lot of these people were Ukrainians. And in fact, there were a bunch of Ukrainians fighting in the German army because of their hatred for Stalin. Well, we were rounding these people up, and Stalin was going to kill them. They knew it. So they had taken refuge in a church. And our orders were to round them up. But the captain called us out one morning and told us about this. And he said that Stalin had assured Roosevelt that he wouldn't hurt them. Did you know that we all laughed? Even way back then, we all laughed when we heard that Stalin wasn't going to hurt these people. The truth is, we didn't care at that point. They were making a big mistake that they were using combat infantrymen to do police work. That's a mistake. The captain says these orders come from the top. Turns out 3 presidents of the United States were involved in that. Roosevelt agreed to it, Truman cooperated, and Eisenhower executed. One of the greatest atrocities ever committed. In fact, a guy later wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal about the number of people murdered by governments. He said more people have been murdered by governments than have been killed in war. And he attributes, I believe, about 500,000 people to England and the United States because of that. He split the difference. He said, we'll just say Stalin killed half of them and you killed half of them. Because Collins couldn't have killed him if you hadn't sent them to him.
Right.
And though it's a guess as to how many there really were. I found out later that a lot of them were not sent. And I was real happy to learn that. What happened is, in 1983, incidentally, I didn't finish that statement. He said the orders came from the top, and we're to put them on these trucks, and we're going to do it even if we have to kill them. Those were our orders. So it's not surprising that. Anyway, I'll show you this sometime. Anyway, the Wall Street Journal.
A deal that.
The Wall Street Journal published an editorial about this in 1983. I didn't even realize that it finally leaked out. I'd been screaming for years about it. So I wrote a letter to the Wall Street Journal, which they published. You won't believe the response I got. I got letters from all over. In fact, I got a phone call the same morning that it was published from New York saying my mother was there in that church. But what had happened was they put him in a warehouse that night to put on the train the next day, and the guards let a big part of him escape. I was so grateful. And I got letters about how some guys grieving how they had participated, other guys who had not cooperated. She'll get it probably. I'll let her get it. Other guys, ingenious ways, particularly military police that had not cooperated. See, that was bad. Those guys were trained, and they knew this was wrong. And they had stalled and stalled and stalled till it finally blew over. And so a lot of them never really got sent back. I don't know what the total number was.
And this operation was called keel haul?
Keel haul, which again shows. Do you know what a keel hauling is?
No.
Okay. Back in the old Navy, 18th century Navy, when a sailor wanted to be badly punished, they tied a rope to him. They ran the rope under the ship. Then they threw him overboard and pulled him under the ship. Maybe he was dead and maybe he was alive. That was keel hauling. Can you imagine the cynicism of calling this Operation Keel Haul? In other words, the guys that did that knew that we were probably killing a big part of it. Because sometimes he'd come up alive on the other side and sometimes he'd come up dead. That was keel hauling. That was done in the 18th century.
So,
but anyway, I'm going to put all of that in here. I haven't gotten there yet. In fact, at the present time, I'm just out of the hospital. That's where I am. And the thing I'm going to talk about most left is going to be Operation Keel Haul.
When did you go home?
Went home in the end of May of '46. I went to Nuremberg probably December of '45.
And you said you were actually sleeping in the courthouse?
Oh yeah, lived there. But let me tell you what my job was.
Yeah, what was your job?
Oh yeah, it wasn't very romantic, but it was interesting. They had a bunch of a prison camp outside of town where they had a bunch of SS troops. And every morning we'd go out and collect a bunch of these prisoners and bring them in. And our job was to police the ground. It was a big courthouse. Clean the latrines, of which there were 30, and haul the trash out to the dump. But what was interesting was the trash, because the trash was coming right out of the courtroom. So you could sit there and read the documents that were coming in the courtroom on the way out and back again. I was standing right outside the door one time when you probably heard that some of the macabre things they did, like make lampshades out of people with tattooed skin, make wine vessels out of people's skulls, and shrink heads like the headhunters did. I was standing right outside the door when they brought in one of those shrunken heads one day.
Wow.
Yeah. It was.
So you came home, and
I came home, and I frankly just bummed around during the summer. Took the summer off, and then went to school and re-entered college. See, I'd already finished a year of college. because in fact I'd finished a year at Virginia Military Institute and 1 quarter at Baylor.
Right.
But it was sort of a hodgepodge curriculum.
And where, did you go back to Baylor? Or
no, I went to Texas Tech, actually.
Texas Tech?
Because I had a brother out there. That really was a mistake.
Yeah.
Because Tech did not have an accredited chemical engineering department. But I didn't know it. So I went ahead and graduated from Texas Tech.
You know Lannis Hope?
Huh?
You know Lannis Hope?
Yeah, I know Lannis. He lives right over here.
He went to Texas Tech.
You know, I don't think I knew.
Yeah, he was in the band at Texas Tech.
How about that?
Yeah.
Yeah, Lannis lives right over
Right. I did a show with him. That's somebody. Where's your restroom?
It was service ribbons, and I had 2 service ribbons for the Ardennes and the Rhineland, I believe. And
so you didn't get a Broad Star?
No, I never.
You never got any?
No, I never got a medal. Not
As
many
much
guys
as you were,
did. Too busy fighting. Too busy
As much as you were
fighting.
shot at, as much as you shot.
That's right. That's exactly.
As much combat as you were in.
I got combat infantry badge, of course.
Yeah.
that goes without saying.
Yeah.
I got that one.
Right.
But
and when you what rank were you during?
I was a private first class, as high as I ever got.
Yeah.
Well, I'm a dirty desk man.
But you were.
And I argued with my superiors.
Yeah.
There's no way I was ever going. See, that's what I learned. I said, Dick, you'll never get ahead in the military.
Right.
Because you don't get along with your superiors.
Yeah.
You know, the truth.
You ask questions.
The truth of it is,
Yeah.
I never really had bosses that I liked until I came here. Because I had bosses that loved for you to argue with them as long as you were polite. You know, that's part of the learning process, you know.
So you left Texas Tech and
I left Texas Tech and went to work for Lion Oil Company. While I worked for Lion, I married my wife. Incidentally, this is a story in itself. My wife is the little sister of one of my best friends. And I didn't start going, she's 4 years behind in school, so I didn't start going with her until after I got out of college.
Right.
But I married her while I was working for Lion Oil Company. And
where
well, I worked partly in most of the time. For a little while, I was in El Dorado, Arkansas, which is the headquarters. But most of the time, I was out at Snyder, Texas. I don't know whether you know it, but there's a huge oil field at Snyder.
Right.
It was discovered in 48, 49.
Yeah.
And Lion had a big swipe of it.
Right.
Little company with a huge swipe. And so I worked out there most of the time. They built a gas plant out there, and I was engineering the gas plant. And gas plant, by the way, takes gas out of the field, recovers the heavier constituents, and sells what's left to the gas company. They take out the heavy stuff, the natural gasoline, the butane, the propane. Today they take out ethane too, but back in those days we didn't. And you leave the ethane, the methane, and sell that we sold that to Lone Star. And the rest of it, the butane, the propane, and the heaviers we sold.
Right. So soon after that you started teaching?
Well, no. What I decided is that I didn't like what I was doing. And I decided I want to come back and get a graduate degree and get some more interesting work. I really had no idea of teaching at the time. But what happened is that after I got here, as I say, they didn't pay very well. And they had students teaching, and one of them left, and I applied for his position, and they hired me. And I've been there ever since. Actually, I'd finished my master's. They wouldn't hire people unless they had at least a master's. But I went ahead and I taught while I worked on my PhD. Right. And I just kept going. I've been here ever since.
So you taught here for how long?
I taught here a total of 45 years. 38 full-time, 7 half-time.
So what brought you to A&M?
Actually, there was an old boy at the Engineering Extension Service that had talked me into teaching a little short course out there at the Lion Oil Company about gas plants. He'd worked up the short course. And he talked me into coming to A&M.
And you taught for 45 years?
Yeah. And I've loved it.
Yeah.
That's why I
When did you retire?
I didn't finally retire till 03.
Yeah.
You know, some people, with the situation I'm in, some people say, man, you should have retired early. Except, no, I was enjoying myself.
Exactly. How long have you enjoyed being married?
55 years. You told me about next week. 7th of July. Week after next, I guess.
Yeah.
Actually, Joe and I married 1 July. We had our first child the next July and our next child the next August.
I see.
But we waited. About then, I came back to graduate school.
Yeah.
See, I had 2 children when I came back to school, and the third one was born while I was actually still in school.
Right.
But we waited a while to have.
So you had 3 kids?
Yeah. That's one. That's my girls when they're young. You talk to me. You want to see some pretty girls. That's my baby daughter when she was just, I guess, when she was young.
Now where do they live?
Actually, she lives right down the street, 2 houses. And she writes music.
Oh, okay. So you have 2 daughters and a son, is that right?
Here, yeah, and this one up here is my oldest daughter.
Yeah.
She's married to a neurologist in Dallas. He's the one that discovered my situation, by the way.
I see.
That's kind of interesting. I started having a little bit of trouble with dexterity.
Uh-huh.
I was down in Ecuador. I've been hiking 10,000 feet, doing fine. And I noticed this dexterity problem. It wasn't bad, but I couldn't button my pocket back here. Well, Sunday came around and I couldn't tie my tie.
Yeah.
That scared me. So I went up to the emergency room and they couldn't find anything. Told me I needed to see a neurologist. Well, my daughter's married to one, except he was in New York at the time, so I had to wait a couple of days.
Yeah.
As soon as I called him, he said, "You've probably had a little stroke. You better get up here." As soon as I got up there, he took me down to his office, ran an MRI on me. "No, you got a tumor in your brain."
Oh.
But it's a metastasis. So
Yeah.
the next day they ran a CAT scan and I had one up here in my lung. So I got metastasized lung cancer, which is a disaster.
Yeah.
But the thing is, what's so ironic is here I was with lung cancer. I couldn't believe it because my heart-lung capacity was great.
Right.
I mean, for a man 80 years old, I was up there hiking with people 20 years younger than I.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
So it wasn't interfering with my.
Right. So
I could not believe it. If they told me prostate cancer, I wouldn't have been surprised at all. I've had prostate cancer trouble for years.
So they're treating the lung cancer?
Yeah,
now?
they are. I'm taking chemo. That's why I'm sick sometimes. And they radiated the heck out of this. Let me tell you a miracle, though. I have 3 tumors in my brain. Doctor told me they'd kill me within 4 or 6 months if I didn't do something. But they've got up there in Dallas, which is where my son-in-law is, what they call a gamma knife. They aim 201 beams, why one, I don't know, but 201 beams of gamma radiation that they can aim. And they aim them all at the tumor. But each one is so weak that it doesn't hurt your brain. Now they can only do it on the skull because they need in the brain because they need your skull to anchor. See, they put a frame on your head, stick you in the MRI, take a real accurate MRI. They feed that to a computer. Then they take the same frame and stick you inside this gamma knife, and the computer tells it how to fire. And they blast each tumor. And I went down and got an MRI run a couple of weeks ago, and they're all shrinking. Particularly one that was going to kill me. It's shrinking extra well, I was glad to hear. I had one on my brain stem, see, and that was one that was going to kill me.
So now are you still getting treated for the brain tumor?
Well, they're shrinking, but they look at them.
Right.
About every 8 weeks, they want to look at them.
Yeah.
And as long as they're shrinking, that's fine.
Yeah.
But if they don't shrink, or if I get a new one,
right,
they'll have to go in and blast again.
So when was that diagnosed?
I was actually diagnosed on the 17th of, well, that's just 3 months ago. 17th of March. But I'd probably had the darn thing for a year or more.
Yeah.
Don't have any symptoms, though. No symptoms whatsoever until this. This was probably lucky.
Right.
Because this one was going to really do something bad.
Right. And when was the lung diagnosed?
The next day.
The next day.
Oh, yeah, because he told me this was metastasis.
Yeah.
So they ran a full-body CAT scan on me to find it.
Yeah.
And they found this tumor right here.
Yeah.
It was the only other tumor I had, though I had some lymph nodes that were swelling.
Right. Right.
So I had this primary. This is the primary tumor here, though. This is where it started.
Yeah.
But no use in dead. Now, they blasted this one with X-ray. And that knocked the fire out of it. It hit me 13 times with these enormous blasts of X-ray to get rid of that one.
Right.
And it's shrinking.
Yeah.
It takes a while, see, because the body has to reabsorb it.
Right.
It doesn't just go away. It dies.
Right.
And then the body has to. And that's a slow process.
Right. Right.
But as long as they're shrinking, that's the important thing.
Yeah.
Now, they won't cure it.
Yeah.